all set in motion by a homeless veteran's desperate search for shelter in a forgotten subway tunnel beneath Manhattan that would eventually bring experts from the Federal Reserve Bank to his makeshift camp, trigger urgent security protocols from Homeland Security, and ultimately reveal a sealed World War II-era train car containing Federal Reserve silver bullion that had remained untouched for over 7 decades. A discovery that would rewrite American banking history and transform one man's story of post-war trauma into an extraordinary legacy of financial redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Michael Reeves, a 42-year-old former Marine Corps sergeant whose world collapsed when his 3-year battle with PTSD consumed not just his marriage, his career, but his entire future. The man who once led reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan and Iraq was about to make a discovery in the depths of New York City that seemed like the final twist in a series of devastating life decisions. Mike stared at the eviction notice taped to his apartment door, the November morning air cutting through his worn military jacket as he fumbled with keys to his modest studio in Queens, New York. The stark white paper with its official seals and legal terminology represented the final countdown of a financial disaster that had been building for the past 18 months. Ever since his honorable discharge had transformed his structured military life into a desperate struggle for civilian survival, the numbers were merciless in their precision. Total outstanding debt, $42,800. Current bank balance, $37.22. Days until forced eviction, 7. Each figure represented a piece of the life he had tried to build after 14 years of military service, now reduced to mathematical calculations that showed no mercy for service, sacrifice, or the devastating psychological toll that had consumed everything he'd worked to achieve. Inside the apartment, Michael spread the collection of past due notices across his folding table, the same table where he once arranged photographs from his deployments and medals from his decorated service record. The harsh fluorescent light overhead illuminated a financial catastrophe that seemed impossible to escape. Rent payments 3 months behind totaling $5,700. Medical bills from his PTSD treatments exceeding $16,000 despite VA coverage. And credit card debt accumulated during his unemployment, reaching $21,000. The irony wasn't lost on Michael that a man who had once coordinated complex, tactical operations across hostile territories was now completely unable to navigate his own financial territory in any way that could save his housing. His expertise in battlefield reconnaissance and strategic planning, once valued by military commanders and special operations teams, became professionally irrelevant in a civilian job market that had shifted toward technical skills and credentials. That made his military experience seem inadequate without additional education. Michael Reeves had been a reconnaissance specialist with the 1st Marine Division, work that had taken him through 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before an IED explosion during his final deployment left him with a traumatic brain injury and the psychological scars that would eventually erode his ability to function in civilian society. His methodical approach to mission planning and Michael's natural leadership had created a reputation for excellence within his unit, evident in the commendations and medals that now sat in a shoebox under his bed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The diagnosis had arrived on a Thursday afternoon in July, delivered by Dr. William Connors at the VA Medical Center with a clinical directness that medical professionals used to communicate devastating news. The evaluation confirms post-traumatic stress disorder with complicating factors from your TBI, he had explained to Michael, whose hands gripped the arms of the chair in the sterile examination room. We'll develop a comprehensive care plan to manage symptoms and help you transition to civilian life as effectively as possible. What Dr. Connors couldn't convey in that moment was how completely PTSD would dismantle not just Michael's psychological stability, but the entire infrastructure of his financial security. The condition had required increasingly expensive medical treatments, specialized therapies, and lifestyle modifications that transformed his modest savings into inadequate resources consumed by immediate survival needs rather than long-term planning. Michael's decline had been steady but merciless. The strong hands that had once operated complex tactical equipment gradually became unreliable, subject to tremors that made precision work impossible. His clear voice, which had confidently directed squad movements under enemy fire, had been reduced to halting conversations interrupted by anxiety attacks whenever loud noises or crowded spaces triggered traumatic memories. Most devastating had been watching his once strategic mind become trapped in cycles of hypervigilance and emotional dysregulation, creating a cruel awareness of everything being lost while maintaining just enough clarity to understand each progressive limitation. He had continued working as a security consultant for 14 months after diagnosis, adapting his approach to accommodate his condition while attempting to leverage his military experience into a sustainable civilian career. The financial devastation had accelerated during the past 6 months when increasingly severe panic attacks and flashbacks had forced Michael to resign from his position as a night security supervisor at a Manhattan office building. His salary of $48,000 annually had provided the stable foundation for his household budget. Losing this income while medical expenses continued had created an impossible mathematical equation that no amount of careful budgeting could solve. The VA disability benefits that should have provided financial stability had become another casualty of bureaucratic complications. The $2,800 monthly payment he had been counting on was delayed due to paperwork issues and classification disputes about the connection between his TBI and subsequent PTSD symptoms, creating grounds for extended review that had left Michael without essential support during his most vulnerable period. The rejection letter from the VA Benefits Administration remained in Michael's desk drawer, its formal language explaining how insufficient documentation and jurisdictional questions had delayed his claim despite his service record and medical evaluations, providing bureaucratic justification for denying benefits when they were most desperately needed. Michael's attempts to maintain employment while managing his condition had been complicated by the specialized nature of his military expertise. His knowledge of reconnaissance operations and tactical planning was highly specific, but not easily transferable to civilian contexts in the New York metropolitan area, where the job market favored technology, finance, healthcare, and service industries rather than security operations requiring his particular background. The part-time positions he had managed to secure after leaving his security job provided minimal income that couldn't address the mounting debt accumulated during his unemployment. Working 15 hours weekly as a stockroom assistant at a hardware store for $15 per hour generated only $900 monthly before taxes, while weekend shifts at a local veterans outreach center added another $400 to his income, creating a total monthly earnings of approximately $1,300 that was insufficient to cover essential expenses, let alone address accumulated debt. The studio apartment that Michael had rented upon moving to New York 3 years earlier had seemed like a practical choice in Queens' working-class Jackson Heights neighborhood. The 450-square-foot space had provided the minimal requirements he needed while searching for more permanent housing, but rising rents and stagnant wages had transformed what was supposed to be temporary housing into a financial burden he could no longer sustain. The monthly rent of $1,900 exceeded his entire income, creating an unsustainable situation that had led to the eviction proceedings now threatening to eliminate his last connection to stable housing. The rental market in New York City had only grown more competitive and expensive, meaning that even if he could somehow clear his current debt, finding affordable alternative housing would be nearly impossible with his credit history and limited income. Michael's daily routine had become a careful choreography of survival, managing psychological symptoms while simultaneously addressing practical challenges that required constant attention. His mornings began at 4:30 a.m., with breathing exercises and grounding techniques learned during VA therapy sessions, followed by job searches and application submissions targeting any position that might utilize his organizational skills and attention to detail without triggering his anxiety in crowded or unpredictable environments. The remainder of his day was divided between his part-time work commitments and evening hours spent research in financial assistance programs, veterans, resources, and legal aid options that might provide alternatives to homelessness. The emotional toll of simultaneous psychological struggles and financial crisis had created what Dr. Connors identified as compound trauma that made recovery from either challenge significantly more difficult. You're processing the neurological impacts of combat exposure while simultaneously facing the loss of your housing, financial security, and professional identity. Dr. Connors had explained during their bi-weekly sessions funded through the VA's mental health program. Each stress reinforces the others, creating a cycle that can feel overwhelming to anyone, but especially someone with your neurological vulnerabilities. The isolation that accompanied Michael's circumstances had been unexpected and difficult to manage. Fellow veterans from his unit offered emotional support, but had their own struggles with reintegration and family obligations that limited practical assistance. Former colleagues from his security position provided references for job applications, but were located throughout the metropolitan area, making their support meaningful but not immediately helpful for addressing housing and financial challenges. The neighborhood where Michael had lived for 3 years had been populated by working families in service, industry employees with similar financial pressures, but different life experiences that made meaningful connection difficult. The social connections that might have flourished in other circumstances had gradually diminished as his PTSD symptoms worsened, creating awkward interactions with neighbors who didn't know how to respond to his increasingly visible struggle with psychological regulation. Michael's brother Thomas, who lived in Seattle with his family, had offered to help with temporary housing, but relocating would require abandoning the VA treatment program he had established in New York and starting over in a city where he had no professional connections or familiarity with support systems. The decision represented choosing between maintaining some elements of the progress he had made with his current doctors versus accepting help that would require abandoning everything familiar during an already traumatic period. Most painful was Michael's recognition that his military training had prepared him for almost every challenge, except the one he now faced. The discipline, strategic thinking, and resilience that had made him an exceptional Marine now seemed inadequate for navigating a civilian system that operated according to financial algorithms and bureaucratic procedures rather than the clear objectives and chain of command he had mastered during his service. The medical bills that continued arriving months after treatment sessions served as recurring reminders of both his ongoing struggle and his impossible financial situation. Statements from specialists, therapy providers, and pharmaceutical companies created a paper trail of the past year's desperate attempts to maintain psychological stability, now transformed into financial obligations that threatened to eliminate any possibility of stability in Michael's future. The $37 that remained in Michael's checking account after paying for his medication and groceries represented the complete extent of his liquid assets, money that needed to last until his next paychecks while also covering transportation to work and basic necessities. The amount was simultaneously everything he had and completely inadequate for addressing any unexpected expense or opportunity that might require immediate financial commitment. Michael's morning routine of reviewing job listings and financial obligations had become a ritual of managed desperation, each day requiring careful calculation of which bills could be delayed, which opportunities might be worth pursuing, and which aspects of his former life needed to be abandoned to focus on immediate survival. The man who had once confidently led reconnaissance teams through hostile territory was now overwhelmed by the complexity of prioritizing competing financial obligations that all seemed equally urgent and impossible to address. The Veterans Outreach Center where Michael worked weekends had become a bittersweet reminder of both the support available and the limitations of that support in his specific situation. Surrounded by people who understood military experience and genuinely wanted to help veterans transition to civilian life, he was still unable to identify a clear pathway to address his housing crisis and psychological needs simultaneously. His expertise in crisis management remained intact, but its application to his personal circumstances was complicated by the neurological impacts of his trauma and the bureaucratic complexity of systems designed to help people in standard categories, rather than those with compound challenges that crossed multiple domains of need. But it was during one of these desperate mornings, exactly 6 days before his scheduled eviction, that Michael made a decision that would change the trajectory of his story. Recognizing that he was likely to become homeless within the week, he began researching emergency shelter options and alternative housing that might provide temporary stability while he continued searching for employment and financial assistance. The options were limited and discouraging. City shelters were overcrowded and often dangerous, particularly for someone with PTSD and hypervigilance that made sleeping in communal spaces nearly impossible. Veterans transitional housing programs had waiting lists extending months into the future, timeframes that wouldn't address his immediate needs. Hotels and hostels required deposits and daily rates that would quickly exhaust his remaining resources without providing any long-term solution. It was while searching online forums where homeless individuals shared survival strategies that Michael encountered an unusual suggestion that captured his attention. A post from someone identifying as a former tunnel resident described a network of abandoned subway tunnels beneath Manhattan where small communities of homeless people had established relatively secure living spaces away from the dangers of street life and the restrictions of official shelter systems. The post included specific information about access points, security considerations, and unofficial protocols that governed these underground communities, presenting them as alternative options for people with specific needs that weren't met by conventional homeless services. The description emphasized that these environments weren't appropriate for everyone, but could provide temporary stability for those willing to adapt to challenging conditions, while working toward more permanent housing solutions. Michael's initial reaction was skepticism mixed with desperate consideration. His military training had included operations in confined spaces and hostile environments, potentially preparing him for conditions that would be unmanageable for others. The psychological implications of moving underground were concerning given his PTSD, but perhaps less immediately destabilizing than navigating overcrowded shelters with unpredictable social dynamics that frequently triggered his worst symptoms. Most compelling was the post's emphasis on the autonomy available in these spaces, the ability to establish a secure personal area without institutional restrictions or schedules that complicated maintaining employment while staying in conventional shelters. If he could establish a stable living situation, even in such unconventional circumstances, perhaps he could preserve his part-time jobs while continuing to search for better opportunities and housing solutions. The decision was simultaneously desperate and strategic, reflecting both the limited options available and Michael's military background in adapting to difficult circumstances when conventional approaches proved inadequate. If his apartment would be lost within days regardless of his actions, perhaps using his remaining resources to establish an alternative living situation made More sense than exhausting them on temporary measures that wouldn't prevent eventual homelessness. Michael spent the remainder of that day researching underground infrastructure and gathering supplies that might be useful for surviving in subterranean environments. His military training had emphasized the importance of proper preparation for any operation, particularly those involving unknown territory and extended duration. The planning provided a sense of purpose and control that had been absent during months of merely responding to cascading financial disasters. His research revealed that New York City's underground infrastructure included not only active subway tunnels but also abandoned stations, maintenance corridors, and incomplete construction projects, dating back decades, creating a complex network that extended beneath Manhattan's streets, largely unknown to most residents who traveled above ground. These spaces had histories of unofficial occupation during various periods of economic hardship, from the Great Depression through the 1980s homelessness crisis and into the present day. The supplies Michael assembled reflected both his immediate needs and longer-term sustainability: a waterproof sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, multiple flashlights with extra batteries, non-perishable food, water purification tablets, basic first aid supplies, and minimal cooking equipment that could function without electricity. He consolidated his most important documents and medications into a waterproof container, along with photographs and military mementos that represented his only meaningful personal possessions. The preparation felt familiar and oddly comforting, similar to mission planning operations he had conducted countless times during his military service. The clear objectives and methodical assessment of resources created a psychological structure that countered the chaos of his recent experiences with financial and housing instability. For the first time in months, Michael was operating in a domain where his training and expertise seemed relevant rather than obsolete. On Sunday evening, with 3 days remaining before his official eviction date, Michael packed his essential supplies into his military backpack and a small duffel bag, left his keys and a note of apology for his landlord on the kitchen counter, and headed toward Manhattan with a hand-drawn map based on information from the online forum. The decision to leave before the formal eviction was partly strategic, allowing him to depart on his own terms, rather than waiting for sheriff's deputies to remove him, and partly psychological, asserting some control over a situation that had otherwise left him powerless. The access point described in the forum post was located near an active subway station in Lower Manhattan, requiring careful timing to enter unobserved during the late evening hours when maintenance workers changed. Shifts in security surveillance was temporarily reduced. Michael's reconnaissance training proved valuable as he observed the location for nearly 2 hours, noting patterns of movement and identifying the optimal moment to access the maintenance door that would lead to abandoned sections of the tunnel system. The descent into New York's underground infrastructure felt like crossing a boundary between worlds, leaving behind the illuminated streets and regulated spaces of conventional society for a shadow realm governed by different rules and requirements. The maintenance corridor quickly transitioned from regularly serviced areas with functional lighting to progressively more abandoned sections where decades of neglect had created an environment that seemed frozen in time, preserved in darkness, and isolation from the constantly evolving city above. Michael's flashlight illuminated graffiti dating back to the 1970s, alongside more recent markings that served as unofficial navigation aids for those who knew how to interpret them. Small symbols indicated directions to water sources, relatively safe sleeping areas, and potential hazards, a coded system developed by successive generations of underground residents to provide essential information without attracting unwanted attention from authorities or opportunistic predators. The tunnel network expanded beyond what Michael had anticipated, revealing not just transit corridors but larger chambers where construction had been abandoned decades earlier during budget crises that halted subway expansion. These spaces showed evidence of intermittent human occupation, makeshift sleeping platforms constructed from discarded materials, primitive cooking areas with ventilation systems fashioned from repurposed ductwork, and storage niches carved into concrete walls to secure possessions during absences. Most of these areas appeared currently unoccupied, suggesting that the underground population had decreased from earlier periods or relocated to different sections of the extensive tunnel system. The isolation was both concerning and reassuring, offering privacy and security while raising questions about the viability of long-term survival without community support or information sharing that had sustained previous generations of tunnel residents. Michael continued deeper into the system, following the map annotations that indicated areas with access to groundwater, seepage that could be purified for drinking and ventilation, shafts that provided air circulation adequate for preventing dangerous carbon dioxide accumulation. His military training in environmental assessment proved valuable for evaluating survival conditions in what would become his temporary home while he developed longer-term strategies for rebuilding his life above ground. After several hours of careful exploration, Michael discovered an abandoned maintenance alcove approximately half a mile from the nearest active subway line. The space measured roughly 10 by 12 feet, constructed during 1940s subway expansion, but subsequently sealed off when construction plans changed. A ventilation shaft provided adequate air circulation while preventing the worst of the tunnel dampness from penetrating the space, creating conditions that were survivable if not comfortable by conventional standards. The alcove's location offered several strategic advantages beyond its physical characteristics. Its distance from active transit lines reduced the likelihood of discovery by maintenance workers or transit police, while its proximity to an emergency exit provided an evacuation route if conditions became dangerous. Perhaps most importantly, the location was within walking distance of a maintenance ladder that led to a street grate near a 24-hour convenience store with a public restroom, providing access to essential facilities without requiring lengthy underground journeys. As Michael arranged his sleeping bag and organized his supplies in the alcove, he experienced conflicting emotions that reflected the complexity of his situation. The profound failure represented by becoming homeless after years of decorated military service created a sense of shame and disappointment that contrasted with the practical accomplishment of establishing a secure location using skills developed during that same service. The strategic thinking that had once served national security objectives was now focused entirely on personal survival. The space itself provided a psychological buffer that had been absent in his increasingly precarious apartment situation. No landlord could evict him from this unofficial territory. No collection agencies could locate him to demand payments he couldn't make. No neighbors could observe his struggles with PTSD symptoms that sometimes manifested in ways that created social discomfort and isolation. The very invisibility that represented social failure also created a strange form of freedom from expectations he could no longer meet. That first night underground represented the beginning of an existence that would challenge Michael's resilience, an adaptability beyond anything he had experienced since his military deployments. The darkness was nearly absolute when he extinguished his flashlight to conserve batteries, creating a sensory deprivation that was simultaneously disorienting and oddly calming for someone whose hypervigilance made normal urban environments overwhelming with their constant stimulation. The sounds of distant subway operations, rumbling trains, maintenance equipment, and occasional worker conversations created an ambient soundtrack that required adjustment but eventually formed a predictable pattern that helped mark the passage of time in an environment without natural light. The temperature remained constant regardless of surface weather conditions, approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit with minimal fluctuation, requiring his sleeping bag for comfort, but never reaching dangerous extremes. As Michael established his survival routine over the subsequent days. He developed systems for addressing basic needs while maintaining his part-time employment and continuing to search for better opportunities. He would emerge before dawn each morning, using public restrooms at 24-hour establishments to maintain basic hygiene before traveling to his hardware store job or veteran center shifts. His military background had trained him to function effectively. With minimal sleep and resources, skills that now served his civilian survival in ways he had never anticipated. The practical challenges of underground living were substantial but manageable through careful planning and resource conservation. Water collected from specific seepage points could be purified for drinking and basic washing. Battery-powered. Lights provided illumination for essential activities while being carefully rationed to extend their usability. Non-perishable food required no refrigeration, though its limited variety and nutritional value created long-term concerns that would need addressing through alternative sources. More complex were the psychological dimensions of his new existence. The isolation provided relief from social stressors that had often triggered his PTSD symptoms, but also eliminated supportive interactions that had helped maintain perspective during difficult periods. The darkness and confined space occasionally triggered memories of combat situations, requiring conscious application of the grounding techniques he had learned during therapy sessions. Most challenging was reconciling his current circumstances with his identity as a decorated Marine who had once led others and contributed to missions of national significance. The contrast between his former responsibilities and current situation created cognitive dissonance that threatened his sense of self-worth and purpose, requiring constant reminders that this underground existence represented a strategic withdrawal, rather than surrender, a temporary position from which he could rebuild rather than a permanent defeat. Michael maintained this precarious existence for nearly 3 weeks, gradually mapping additional sections of the tunnel system during careful exploration between work shifts and job interviews. His increasing familiarity with the underground infrastructure revealed both its hazards and resources, creating a mental geography that expanded his range of movement while identifying areas that should be avoided due to structural concerns or territorial claims by other underground residents. He occasionally glimpsed but rarely engaged directly. The exploration served practical purposes beyond mere mapping, identifying additional water sources, potential emergency exits, and abandoned materials that could improve his living space. But it also provided a sense of purpose and agency that counterbalanced the circumstances that had forced him underground, transforming what could have been merely passive survival into active reconnaissance of territory that few others understood or navigated successfully. It was during one of these exploration sessions, approximately 27 days after establishing his underground residence, that Michael's flashlight illuminated something unexpected in a section of tunnel that appeared to have been sealed for decades. What initially seemed like merely another maintenance dead end revealed unusual features upon closer inspection. A section of track that didn't match standard subway configurations and ended abruptly at what appeared to be a bricked-over tunnel extension. The anomaly in the tunnel system immediately captured Michael's attention in a way that transcended his usual methodical exploration. Unlike the clearly abandoned maintenance areas that formed the majority of his underground territory, this section showed signs of deliberate concealment rather than mere neglect. The brickwork covering what appeared to be a tunnel extension was newer than surrounding infrastructure, suggesting it had been added years after the original construction, while the track configuration indicated a spur line designed for specialized rolling stock rather than standard passenger trains. Michael's reconnaissance training had taught him to recognize significant deviations from environmental patterns, the subtle differences that often indicated important information for tactical assessment. This bricked-over tunnel entrance represented exactly the type of anomaly that would have warranted closer inspection during military operations, a principle that remained relevant despite his dramatically changed circumstances. The decision to investigate further was partly driven by practical survival considerations. Unexplored areas might contain resources or hazards relevant to his current situation, but also by the intellectual engagement that such mysteries provided. The purposeful problem-solving required for this investigation offered psychological benefits beyond mere curiosity, creating meaningful activity that utilized his training and expertise after months of feeling professionally irrelevant. Initial examination of the brickwork revealed professional construction that had nonetheless deteriorated over decades of exposure to tunnel moisture and temperature fluctuations. Small cracks had formed between sections, allowing glimpses of a void space beyond rather than the solid fill that would typically be used when permanently closing unused tunnels. More intriguingly, Michael noticed subtle air movement through these cracks, suggesting the sealed area connected to ventilation systems still in operation despite being officially abandoned. After careful consideration of structural stability and potential hazards, Michael began systematically testing the brickwork, identifying sections where deterioration had weakened mortar joints sufficiently to allow careful removal without risking collapse. The work was slow and methodical, conducted during hours when distant subway operations provided ambient noise coverage while requiring frequent pauses to listen for approaching maintenance workers who might question his unauthorized construction activity. After nearly 6 hours of careful labor spread across 3 days, Michael had created an opening approximately 2 feet square sufficient for passage, while minimizing structural disruption to surrounding infrastructure. His flashlight beam penetrated the darkness beyond, revealing a tunnel segment approximately 30 feet long that terminated at what appeared to be a metal barrier. Unlike standard subway construction materials or techniques, the short tunnel segment contained track configurations designed for specialized rolling stock, with dimensions and weight capacities that exceeded standard subway specifications. Most notably, the area showed none of the vandalism or unofficial occupation evidence common throughout the rest of the abandoned system, suggesting it had remained completely sealed and undiscovered since its original closure decades earlier. The metal barrier at the tunnel's end initially appeared to be merely a solid wall, but closer inspection revealed the outline of what seemed to be a massive door or hatch set flush with the surrounding frame. Unlike the deteriorating brickwork at the tunnel entrance, this metal installation showed remarkable preservation, with minimal corrosion despite decades in the damp underground environment, suggesting specialized materials designed for long-term durability in adverse conditions. What particularly captured Michael's attention was a small identification plate mounted near what appeared to be a locking mechanism. The plate's surface was tarnished but still legible, bearing the inscription, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Secure Transport Division, alongside a serial number and manufacturing date of June 1943. Official designation transformed Michael's exploration from merely interesting to potentially significant, suggesting he had discovered infrastructure connected to government financial operations during the World War II era. The implications were immediately apparent to anyone familiar with American financial history. During World War II, the Federal Reserve had conducted unprecedented operations to secure national gold and silver reserves against potential enemy action, moving precious metals from vulnerable coastal locations to more defensible inland repositories, while maintaining essential monetary system functions during wartime mobilization. This tunnel spur and secure door appeared to be part of that emergency infrastructure, designed for transporting and potentially storing monetary reserves beneath Manhattan streets. The discovery presented Michael with a complex decision about how to proceed. His unauthorized presence in the tunnel system was already technically illegal, though generally tolerated by authorities who recognized the limited housing alternatives available to the city's homeless population. Tampering with Federal Reserve infrastructure, however, would represent a substantially more serious legal issue, potentially involving federal criminal statutes rather than mere trespassing violations. Yet the historical significance of this sealed tunnel segment was undeniable, representing a previously undocumented component of wartime financial security measures that had shaped American monetary policy throughout the mid-20th century. The academic and historical value of such a discovery could potentially outweigh the legal risks if properly reported and documented through appropriate channels. After careful consideration of various approaches, Michael decided on a middle path that would document the discovery, while seeking official assistance without immediately surrendering his underground residence or exposing himself to legal consequences for his unauthorized exploration. Using his phone's camera, he took detailed photographs of the tunnel segment, metal barrier, and Federal Reserve identification plate, being careful to exclude any images that would reveal his living area or the specific access routes he had established. The Veterans Outreach Center where Michael worked weekends maintained relationships with various government agencies and academic institutions that assisted former military personnel with employment, housing, and educational opportunities. These connections could potentially provide a pathway for reporting his discovery without immediately involving law enforcement that might prioritize trespassing violations over historical significance. During his next weekend shift, Michael approached Dr. Eleanor Harmon, the center's director and a former Army historian who had specialized in World War II logistics operations before transitioning to veteran services. Without revealing his current living situation, Michael described his interest in urban exploration, photography, and his discovery of what appeared to be abandoned Federal Reserve infrastructure during a recent documentation project. Dr. Harmon's immediate interest confirmed Michael's assessment of the discovery's potential significance. The Fed's wartime operations have been extensively studied from financial and policy perspectives, she explained while examining his photographs, but the physical infrastructure they developed remains largely undocumented in academic literature. These emergency transport systems were classified during wartime and subsequently abandoned without public disclosure when no longer needed. More importantly, Dr. Harmon offered to connect Michael with professional contacts who could help evaluate the discovery's historical significance without necessarily involving agencies that would prioritize security concerns over preservation and documentation. I know people at both the Federal Reserve's Historical Archive Division and the National Archives who specialize in financial infrastructure history. They could provide context for your discovery while ensuring appropriate historical preservation before security protocols potentially restrict access. The connections Dr. Harmon provided transformed Michael's solitary discovery into a collaborative historical investigation that expanded beyond his initial expectations. Dr. Richard Keller from the Federal Reserve's Historical Division expressed immediate interest in the photographs, confirming that the tunnel segment likely represented part of an emergency transport system developed during 1942-1943 when coastal financial centers faced potential enemy attack. According to our archives, the New York Fed constructed several secure transport corridors connecting their primary vault with alternative storage facilities throughout Manhattan. Dr. Keller explained during their initial meeting at the Veterans Center. These systems were designed for moving gold and silver reserves quickly if the primary vault faced imminent threat, but most were decommissioned and sealed after the war ended. Your discovery appears to be one such corridor that wasn't properly documented during decommissioning. Dr. Keller's preliminary research in response to Michael's photographs had identified records indicating that one such transport corridor had been used for moving silver reserves during a specific operation in late 1944, when industrial demand for silver required transferring bullion from deep storage to production facilities, manufacturing essential war materials. The operation had involved temporarily storing approximately 200,000 troy ounces of silver bullion in specialized transport Cars designed for underground movement between secured facilities. Most intriguingly, Dr. Keller's research had uncovered discrepancies in the operations documentation that had never been resolved. The silver transfer records showed complete movement from primary vaults to industrial destinations, but intermediate transport logs contained gaps that financial historians had previously attributed to wartime. Record-keeping inconsistencies rather than actual accounting errors. There's a compelling possibility that your discovery might help resolve a minor but persistent mystery in Federal Reserve wartime operations, Dr. Keller explained, his academic excitement evident despite his professional restraint. If this is indeed the missing transport corridor from Operation Silver Shield, it might contain documentation or even physical evidence of silver movements that would complete our historical understanding of wartime monetary policy implementation. The historical investigation quickly expanded beyond academic interest when Dr. Keller shared Michael's photographs with current Federal Reserve security officials responsible for maintaining continuity with historical systems. James Wilson, Deputy Director of the New York Fed's Infrastructure Security Division, contacted Michael directly to request a meeting regarding what he described as potentially significant historical discovery with security implications for current operations. The meeting with Wilson introduced official dimensions that transformed Michael's underground exploration from personal survival strategy to matter of potential national significance. The tunnel system you've documented appears to connect with infrastructure that remains classified under federal financial security protocols, Wilson explained during their initial discussion at the Federal Reserve Building. While the specific transport corridor was decommissioned in 1945, its connection points to our current secure movement network require comprehensive security assessment before public documentation can proceed. Wilson's team proposed a collaborative approach that would address both historical preservation interests and current security requirements. A controlled examination of the sealed tunnel segment conducted by Federal Reserve security personnel with historical preservation experts present to document significant features before any modification or removal occurred. Michael would participate as the original discoverer, receiving appropriate compensation for his contribution, while providing essential information about access routes and physical conditions. The compensation offer was substantial enough to potentially transform Michael's housing situation, providing resources that could secure stable accommodation while he continued rebuilding his civilian life. More significantly, Wilson suggested that Michael's military background and personal initiative in documenting the discovery made him potentially valuable for consulting work related to infrastructure security assessment, creating professional opportunities that aligned with his training and experience in ways that previous civilian employment had not. The formal investigation began 3 days later with a team that included Federal Reserve security specialists, historical preservation experts, and engineering contractors qualified for assessing abandoned infrastructure safety. Michael guided them through access routes to the sealed tunnel segment, carefully avoiding his personal living area while providing essential information about surrounding tunnel conditions and potential hazards. The team's specialized equipment quickly confirmed what Michael had suspected during his initial exploration. The metal barrier was indeed a massive security door designed for controlling access to a transport chamber beyond. Unlike modern electronic security systems, this 1940s installation relied on mechanical locking mechanisms that had remained sealed since their last official operation decades earlier. The security specialists determined that the door's locking system remained partially functional despite decades without maintenance, though excessive force would be required to overcome corrosion and mechanical deterioration that had occurred in the intervening years. After consultation with historical preservation experts, the team decided to attempt opening the door using period-appropriate techniques rather than modern cutting equipment that would damage the original mechanisms. The process required nearly 6 hours of careful manipulation and controlled application of specialized lubricants designed for deteriorated mechanical systems. The preservation experts meticulously documented each component and technique, creating both historical records and potential procedures for addressing similar installations that might be discovered in other decommissioned Federal Reserve facilities throughout the country. When the massive door finally yielded to their efforts, swinging ponderously on hinges designed for multi-ton loads, the team's flashlights illuminated a chamber that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations regarding historical significance and potential financial implications. The space beyond contained a specialized transport car approximately 30 feet long, its exterior marked with Federal Reserve identification codes and security classifications from the World War II era. Unlike the typical rail cars used for conventional transit, this vehicle featured armored construction with reinforced walls and specialized sealing systems, designed to protect contents from environmental damage during extended storage. Most remarkably, the car appeared completely intact, showing minimal deterioration despite 7 decades in sealed storage, a testament to both the quality of its construction and the environmental stability of the underground chamber, where temperature and humidity had remained nearly constant throughout the intervening years. The car's exterior markings included shipping documentation partially visible beneath layers of dust, indicating contents designated as Treasury Class 1 Reserve materials, with origination dates from November 1944 and destination codes that matched Dr. Keller's research about Operation Silver Shield. The documentation included official seals and signatures from Federal Reserve officials long deceased, creating a direct connection with financial operations conducted during the height of World War II industrial mobilization. The security team's initial assessment indicated that the transport car remained sealed according to 1940s protocols, with original locking mechanisms and security seals intact, suggesting that whatever contents had been placed inside during wartime operations had remained undisturbed throughout the subsequent decades. This preservation status transformed the discovery from merely historical curiosity to potential Treasury asset recovery operation, requiring additional protocols and specialized personnel before proceeding further. As the investigation expanded to include Treasury Department officials and specialized secure materials handling teams, Michael found himself in an increasingly central role despite his unconventional circumstances. His military background provided credibility with security personnel, while his first-hand knowledge of the surrounding tunnel system offered practical advantages for operational planning that outside experts couldn't match regardless of their official credentials. The decision to open the transport car required approval from multiple federal agencies and careful preparation to ensure both security and historical preservation throughout the process. The operation was scheduled for the following week, allowing time for assembling appropriate personnel and equipment, while establishing controlled access routes that would maintain operational security throughout the recovery process. During this preparation period, Michael continued his careful balance between cooperating with official investigation and maintaining his independence in underground residence. The financial compensation he had received for his discovery documentation provided resources for immediate needs, but he remained reluctant to abandon the security of his established living space until more permanent housing could be arranged, particularly given the uncertainty surrounding potential outcomes from the ongoing investigation. This caution proved warranted when preliminary research by Treasury officials identified potentially significant legal implications regarding the transport car's contents. According to historical records, the silver bullion transported during Operation Silver Shield had been designated for essential wartime industrial production, primarily photographic materials and specialized electronics that supported military intelligence operations. This designation created complex ownership questions regarding any materials that might have remained sealed in the transport car rather than reaching their intended wartime destinations. The legal framework surrounding wartime strategic materials involves multiple jurisdictions and precedents, explained Treasury legal specialist Catherine Morrison during a planning meeting 3 days before the scheduled opening. Materials designated for war production remained government property even when allocated to specific industrial applications. If these silver reserves never reached their designated recipients due to operational oversight, they would technically remain Treasury assets despite the passage of time. The potential financial implications were substantial at current market values. 200,000 troy ounces of silver would be worth approximately $5.8 million, creating significant questions about proper disposition and potential claims from both government agencies and historical preservation interests. While Treasury officials emphasized that accurate assessment would require actual inspection of the car's contents, the possibility of substantial value recovery added complexity to what had begun as merely historical documentation. Throughout these developments, Michael maintained perspective on his unusual situation, from homeless veteran to historically significant discoverer potentially instrumental in recovering millions in government assets. The contrast between his personal circumstances and the national significance of his discovery created cognitive dissonance that both his military training and PTSD therapy had prepared him to manage through compartmentalization and focus on immediate objectives rather than broader implications. The evening before the scheduled transport car opening, Michael returned to his underground living space to collect essential items before joining the official operation team early the following morning. As he organized his belongings in the alcove that had provided shelter during his most desperate period, he reflected on the unlikely sequence of events that had connected his personal crisis with historical preservation and potential financial recovery of national significance. The very circumstances that had seemed most devastating, his eviction, financial collapse, and descent into unofficial underground existence, had positioned him to make a discovery that would have remained concealed if he had maintained conventional housing and employment. The reconnaissance skills that had seemed professionally irrelevant in civilian contexts had proven essential for navigating abandoned infrastructure and recognizing significant anomalies that others would have overlooked or ignored. As Michael prepared for the next day's operation that would potentially transform both historical understanding and his personal circumstances, he recognized that resilience sometimes manifested through unexpected pathways rather than conventional recovery trajectories. The underground existence that represented failure by normal social standards had created opportunities for utilizing his specialized capabilities in ways that conventional employment never could have provided. With this perspective, Michael joined the federal operation team the following morning at their secure staging area, ready to witness the final revelation of what his unlikely underground exploration had uncovered beneath Manhattan's crowded streets. A sealed transport car that had patiently preserved its wartime secrets for over 7 decades until a homeless veteran's desperate search for shelter had brought it back into human awareness and official recognition. The morning of the transport car opening dawned with unusual clarity for Michael, the significance of the day creating a psychological focus that momentarily pushed aside his chronic hypervigilance and anxiety. The federal operation team had established their staging area in a maintenance facility connected to the active subway system, transforming the utilitarian space into a command center equipped with specialized tools, documentation equipment, and security protocols that reflected the operation's unusual combination of historical preservation and potential asset recovery. Dr. Keller from the Federal Reserve's Historical Division greeted Michael with genuine respect that contrasted sharply with the dismissive treatment he had experienced during most civilian interactions since his discharge. Your discovery might rewrite a significant chapter in American financial history, the historian explained while reviewing the day's procedural timeline. This operation represents the first documented recovery of wartime Federal Reserve transport infrastructure in its original sealed condition. The team assembled for the operation reflected its multifaceted objectives, including Treasury Department secure materials specialists, Federal Reserve security personnel, historical preservation experts, structural engineers, and documentation specialists equipped with high-resolution imaging technology. Most notably, the operation included representatives from the Smithsonian Institution's American History Division, indicating that regardless of any financial value discovered, the historical significance had already been formally recognized at the highest levels of cultural preservation. Michael's role had been carefully defined during the planning process. He would guide the team through access routes he had discovered, provide context regarding surrounding tunnel conditions, and serve as the original discoverer witness for official documentation purposes. This positioning balanced security protocols against recognition of his essential contribution, creating official acknowledgement without requiring disclosure of his complete underground living situation. The journey through the tunnel system took approximately 40 minutes, following routes that Michael had carefully mapped during his weeks of exploration. Unlike his solitary journeys with minimal lighting and equipment, this official expedition moved with the confidence of institutional support. Portable lighting systems illuminated the path. Communication equipment maintained contact with surface operations, and security personnel established perimeter control at key junctions to prevent unauthorized observation. Upon reaching the sealed tunnel segment Michael had discovered, the team established a formal documentation perimeter before proceeding further. Historical preservation specialists photographed and measured every aspect of the approach area, recording the environmental conditions and structural features that had contributed to the site's remarkable preservation over 7 decades of abandonment. Dr. Eleanor Harmon from the Veterans Center had joined the operation in her capacity as military historian, providing essential context regarding wartime logistics operations that had shaped both the physical infrastructure and the security protocols surrounding strategic material movements during World War II. Her presence provided continuing connection to Michael's initial reporting pathway while adding academic credibility to the historical documentation process. What we're seeing here represents the intersection of military necessity, financial security, and engineering innovation during a period when the nation's entire infrastructure was being adapted for wartime priorities, Dr. Harmon explained as the team prepared to enter the sealed tunnel segment. These emergency transport systems were developed when coastal cities faced genuine threats from enemy action, creating legitimate fears about vulnerability of financial reserves that could have crippled war production if compromised. The security team proceeded through the passage Michael had created in the brick barrier, expanding the opening to accommodate their equipment while carefully documenting the original closure construction. The short tunnel segment beyond showed remarkable preservation compared to surrounding infrastructure, its specialized track and reinforced walls demonstrating the priority placed on protecting financial assets, even within the already secure underground environment. Upon reaching the massive security door that the team had partially opened during their initial assessment, Treasury specialists conducted atmospheric testing to ensure that the chamber beyond contained no hazardous gases or deterioration byproducts. Before proceeding with full access operations, the tests confirmed stable environmental conditions suitable for both personnel safety and artifact preservation, allowing the documentation team to establish comprehensive recording equipment before the transport car's sealed environment would be disturbed. The atmosphere was remarkably tense as final preparations were completed. Decades of professional training and institutional protocols confronting an unprecedented situation that combined historical discovery, potential asset recovery, and security implications that crossed multiple federal jurisdictions. Despite extensive planning, this moment represented genuine uncertainty regarding what exactly had remained sealed within the specialized transport car since its wartime operation. "We're not just opening a storage container," Dr. Keller observed. Quietly, as the security specialists prepared the final access procedures, "We're creating a direct connection with financial decisions made during the most significant military mobilization in American history. Whatever we find inside exists because someone made specific decisions during extraordinary circumstances that were never properly documented or resolved." The transport car's exterior had been fully documented during the team's initial discovery, but now specialists conducted detailed examination of its security seals and locking mechanisms before attempting access. The original securing system showed no evidence of tampering or unauthorized access attempts, confirming that whatever had been sealed inside during wartime operations had remained undisturbed throughout the intervening decades. The car's main access door featured a specialized dual-key locking system, typical of high-security Federal Reserve operations during the 1940s, requiring simultaneous operation of separate mechanisms to prevent unauthorized entry, even by individuals with partial access authorization. These systems had been designed specifically to require multiple officials with different institutional authorities to cooperate for accessing strategic reserves, creating procedural security that supplemented physical protections. After extensive documentation of the original locking components, the Treasury specialists applied carefully developed techniques for operating deteriorated mechanical systems without causing structural damage to historically significant mechanisms. The process required nearly 30 minutes of painstaking manipulation, with preservation specialists recording every movement and component interaction for future restoration reference. When the locking system finally yielded to their careful efforts, releasing mechanisms that had remained engaged since 1944, the massive door initially refused to move on hinges frozen by decades of inactivity. Structural engineers assessed the situation before recommending controlled application of specialized penetrating lubricants developed for aerospace applications involving long-dormant mechanical systems, materials that would provide necessary function without damaging original components. The door's eventual movement occurred gradually rather than dramatically, accompanied by the low grinding sound of metal surfaces moving against each other for the first time in over 70 years. The team maintained strict discipline despite the moment's significance, following established protocols for creating and maintaining a sterile recovery environment that would preserve any contents in their discovered condition without contamination or disruption. As the door opened sufficiently for initial visual assessment, powerful documentary lighting illuminated the transport car's interior for the first time since World War II officials had sealed it decades earlier. The car's design reflected its specialized purpose, unlike conventional rail cars with passenger accommodations or open freight capacity. This vehicle had been constructed specifically for secure bullion transport, with reinforced storage compartments lining both sides of a narrow central access corridor. Most remarkably, the compartments were visibly occupied, their contents protected by secondary security doors with official Treasury seals still intact across locking mechanisms. These interior compartments featured individual documentation, packets mounted in specialized holders, containing what appeared to be manifest records and security verification forms that had accompanied whatever materials remained sealed inside. "This exceeds our most optimistic expectations," whispered Treasury Recovery Specialist Thomas Blackwell as the documentation team captured initial imagery before anyone would enter the car. "We're looking at completely intact storage systems, with original documentation still in place. From a preservation perspective, this is essentially a time capsule of wartime financial security operations." After establishing appropriate environmental monitoring and documenting the undisturbed interior configuration, the team implemented carefully planned access protocols that would maintain both historical preservation standards and secure materials handling requirements. The first personnel to enter the transport car included documentation specialists who would record every aspect of the interior before any compartments would be opened or contents disturbed. The car's interior revealed unexpected details that enhanced its historical significance beyond the potential value of any contents. The walls contained operational instructions for emergency procedures, manufacturing information indicating the car's construction at a specialized facility in Pennsylvania during 1942, and most intriguingly, handwritten notations from personnel who had operated the transport system during its active period. These human touches, including a maintenance log with entries dating from 1942 through November 1944, and what appeared to be a good luck charm mounted beside the operator's position, created immediate emotional connection with the individuals who had managed this strategic transport system during wartime emergency conditions. The historical preservation team carefully documented these elements, while Treasury specialists focused on the sealed storage compartments that represented the operation's primary objective. The documentation packets mounted outside each storage compartment provided the first specific information about the car's contents. According to these records, the transport operation had involved moving 193,450 troy ounces of Treasury silver designated for industrial production under Operation Silver Shield, primarily photographic materials essential for aerial reconnaissance and intelligence operations. The documentation included Treasury authorization codes, Federal Reserve transport verification, and national defense priority designations that had placed this material movement at the highest level of wartime logistics operations. Most significantly, the documentation explained why this particular transport car had remained sealed and abandoned rather than completing its designated movement to industrial production facilities. According to the final entry in the operational log, dated November 17, 1944, the transport had been temporarily secured in this emergency siding when mechanical problems in the main tunnel system prevented completion of its scheduled movement. The entry indicated that the car would remain secured until repair operations could be completed, with an estimated delay of 2 to 3 days before transport would resume. This explains the historical gap in our records. Dr. Keller observed with academic excitement as the documentation was carefully photographed and transcribed. The operation was interrupted by infrastructure problems, but before transport could resume, priorities shifted due to changing war production requirements. The delay coincided with strategic reassessment of silver allocation that redirected available reserves to different production facilities through alternative transport routes. The combination of infrastructure failure and rapidly evolving wartime priorities had effectively stranded this particular shipment in temporary storage that became permanent when operational focus shifted elsewhere. The tunnel repair records from late 1944 confirmed major maintenance operations in the main Federal Reserve transport system, but contained no reference to the temporarily stored silver shipment that had essentially been forgotten in the overwhelming logistics demands of wartime operations. After comprehensive documentation of the car's interior configuration and historical records, the team proceeded to the most sensitive phase of the operation, accessing the sealed storage compartments to assess their contents after 7 decades of secured storage. Treasury specialists led this process, applying specialized techniques for operating the original security systems without damaging historical mechanisms or potentially compromising whatever materials remained inside. The first compartment opened to reveal precisely what the documentation had described: stacked trays containing silver bullion ingots with Treasury hallmarks and serial numbers corresponding to the manifest records. Each ingot had been individually wrapped in specialized protective material before placement in fitted trays, designed to prevent movement or damage during transport operations. The preservation was remarkable. Upon careful removal of the protective wrapping, the silver surfaces showed minimal tarnishing or environmental damage, despite the decades in underground storage. As additional compartments were systematically accessed and documented, the team confirmed that the entire shipment appeared intact according to the original manifest, approximately 193,450 troy ounces of silver bullion that had been designated for essential wartime production but never reached its intended destination due to logistical disruption and shifting priorities. At current market values, the silver itself represented approximately $5.6 million in precious metal value, but its historical significance and pristine preservation potentially increased its value substantially beyond mere commodity pricing. Beyond the silver itself, the compartments contained additional historical artifacts that enhanced the discovery's significance for American financial and military history. These included detailed allocation documents indicating the specific war production priorities that had justified this particular silver movement, security protocols describing how the material would be utilized and accounted for during industrial processing, and most intriguingly, communication records between Federal Reserve officials and military production authorities regarding strategic material priorities during late 1944. These documents provide unprecedented insight into how financial and military authorities coordinated strategic material movements during critical production phases. Dr. Harmon noted as preservation specialists carefully transferred documents to specialized containers for transport to climate-controlled facilities. The operational details described here have never been available to historians researching wartime production coordination. As the documentation and recovery operation continued throughout the day, Michael observed the proceedings with a perspective shaped by both his military background and current circumstances. The precision and purpose demonstrated by the various specialists reflected the same institutional competence he had experienced during military operations, creating a familiar environment that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty and rejection he had encountered in most civilian contexts since his discharge. Most striking was the transformation in how these officials, representatives of the same government institutions that had seemed indifferent to his housing crisis and employment struggles, now engaged with him as a valued contributor rather than a problem to be managed. The very skills and attributes that had seemed irrelevant in conventional employment contexts were suddenly recognized as valuable by authorities operating outside normal bureaucratic frameworks. The operation continued for nearly 14 hours, with specialized teams documenting and securing each component of the discovery according to protocols that balanced historical preservation against security requirements for strategic materials. Throughout this extended process, Michael's participation evolved beyond merely guiding access to the site. His observational capabilities and systematic approach to environmental assessment provided valuable insights regarding tunnel conditions and structural considerations that informed the team's ongoing operations. By evening, the recovery phase had been completed, with all silver bullion and historical documentation secured in specialized transport containers, designed for maintaining both physical security and preservation conditions. The transport car itself had been comprehensively documented, but would remain in place, pending decisions regarding potential recovery for museum preservation, creating opportunities for additional historical assessment before any modification to the original discovery site. As the team prepared for extraction with their secured materials, Treasury official Catherine Morrison approached Michael with information that would transform his personal circumstances as significantly as his discovery had impacted historical understanding. The Treasury Department has authorized a finder's recognition payment for your role in this recovery operation, she explained, presenting official documentation rather than merely verbal assurance. While the silver remains government property, under wartime allocation regulations, your discovery and assistance in recovery qualifies for substantial recognition under federal historic preservation incentives. The documentation outlined an immediate payment of $850,000 calculated as 15% of the base metal value of the recovered silver, with additional consideration for historical significance, pending final assessment by Smithsonian and Federal Reserve Historical Divisions. This immediate recognition would be processed through expedited procedures developed for sensitive historical discoveries, with funds available within approximately 10 business days through dedicated Treasury channels. This recognition reflects both the material value recovered and the historical significance of your discovery. Morrison continued, maintaining professional demeanor despite delivering information that would fundamentally alter Michael's life circumstances. The documentation and site access you provided prevented potential damage or loss that might have occurred through conventional construction discovery or unauthorized access, preserving both material assets and irreplaceable historical context. The financial recognition represented far more than monetary value. It provided official acknowledgement that Michael's actions, driven initially by desperate survival needs, had ultimately served significant national interests beyond his personal circumstances. This institutional validation offered psychological benefits that transcended the substantial material improvement his new financial resources would provide. As the operation team completed their extraction procedures and began movement toward their secure exit routes, Federal Reserve Security Director Wilson approached Michael with an additional proposition that extended beyond immediate recognition. Your background and demonstrated capabilities during this operation have identified you as potentially valuable for ongoing security assessment projects, he explained, presenting contact information rather than vague assurances. We maintain specialized consulting relationships with individuals possessing unique knowledge of infrastructure vulnerabilities and observational capabilities relevant to financial security operations. The consulting opportunity represented potential long-term professional engagement that would utilize Michael's military training and observational skills in contexts specifically designed to accommodate his PTSD-related limitations rather than expecting him to conform to conventional workplace environments. This pathway offered not just income, but meaningful work connected to national security priorities that resonated with his service motivation while acknowledging his specific capabilities and constraints. As the team departed through carefully secured routes, leaving the historic transport car documented but preserved in its original location, Michael found himself navigating an abrupt transition between worlds, from homeless veteran surviving in abandoned tunnels to financially secure historical discoverer with professional opportunities aligned with his capabilities rather than defined by his limitations. The following days unfolded with administrative procedures that transformed abstract recognition into concrete resources for rebuilding his life, according to sustainable parameters rather than merely temporary relief. The Treasury payment process operated with unprecedented efficiency for government operations, reflecting the specialized procedures developed for sensitive historical discoveries that required discretion and expedited resolution. Michael approached his sudden financial stability with the strategic planning capabilities that had defined his military career, establishing structured priorities that would create sustainable improvement rather than merely temporary relief. His initial focus involved securing appropriate housing that would accommodate his PTSD-related needs, a small but well-designed apartment in a quieter Queens neighborhood with sufficient security features to address his hypervigilance while maintaining access to VA treatment facilities and potential employment locations. Unlike conventional financial windfalls that often generated impulsive spending, Michael's military training and resource management guided his approach to newfound stability. He established appropriate reserves for housing security, healthcare supplements beyond VA coverage, educational resources for developing civilian credentials, and long-term investment that would generate sustainable income beyond immediate consumption. Perhaps most meaningful was Michael's decision to allocate resources for addressing the needs of fellow veterans facing similar challenges during civilian transition. Rather than merely escaping his own difficulties, he established a dedicated foundation that would provide targeted assistance for housing security and professional development, specifically designed for veterans with PTSD and related conditions that complicated conventional employment pathways. The foundation's design reflected Michael's personal experience navigating systemic gaps between available services and actual needs, focusing on practical assistance during transitional periods when institutional support proved inadequate rather than duplicating existing programs. This structured approach to sharing his unexpected resources provided purpose beyond mere financial security, creating meaningful engagement with issues he understood through direct experience. 6 months after his initial discovery, Michael attended the official unveiling of a Smithsonian Institution exhibition, featuring selected artifacts from the recovered transport car, alongside comprehensive historical context about Operation Silver Shield and wartime financial security measures. The exhibition included recognition of his discovery role, alongside academic analysis of how the recovered materials enhanced understanding of World War II home front operations and financial policy implementation during national emergency conditions. The public recognition represented validation beyond financial compensation, acknowledgement that his unconventional pathway through desperate circumstances had ultimately contributed to national historical understanding in ways that more conventional life trajectories might never have achieved. His willingness to navigate abandoned infrastructure during personal crisis had recovered historical materials that professional historians and institutional researchers had never located despite decades of formal investigation. Michael's consulting work with Federal Reserve security operations developed into specialized assessment projects that utilized his unique combination of military training and underground infrastructure knowledge for evaluating potential vulnerabilities in financial security systems. These projects accommodated his PTSD-related limitations while providing meaningful engagement with national security priorities that resonated with his service motivation. Most significantly, Michael's experience navigating extreme transitions from decorated service to homeless survival to historical discovery provided perspective that transcended conventional success narratives. His journey demonstrated how capabilities developed during military service could create unexpected value in civilian contexts that standard transition programs never anticipated or accommodated. 2 years after his tunnel discovery, Michael published a carefully anonymized account of his experience that balanced personal narrative against security considerations, creating a resource for other veterans navigating difficult transitions, while demonstrating how specialized military capabilities could create civilian value through unexpected pathways rather than merely conventional employment tracks. The man who had once led reconnaissance missions through hostile territory, then survived in abandoned infrastructure beneath Manhattan streets, had discovered how the same observational capabilities and environmental assessment skills could create value across radically different contexts, from battlefield operations to homeless survival to historical discovery of national significance. This versatility demonstrated that military training created adaptable capabilities rather than merely specialized skills relevant only within formal service structures. Sometimes the very circumstances that seem most devastating create unique opportunities that wouldn't exist in more conventional life pathways. Michael observed during a Veterans Program presentation 3 years after his discovery. The same tunnel that represented my most desperate moment became the pathway to recovery through completely unexpected means, demonstrating how resilience sometimes manifests through unconventional routes rather than familiar recovery patterns. The unlikely sequence connecting wartime silver movement, abandoned infrastructure, veteran homelessness, and historical recovery illustrated how seemingly disconnected elements could intersect through individual initiative to create meaningful resolution across multiple domains, from personal recovery to institutional discovery to historical preservation. The silver that had been designated for wartime production, but never reached its destination, had ultimately fulfilled different, but equally valuable purpose by creating connection between past priorities and present needs through one veteran's unexpected underground journey. The transformation in Michael's life circumstances extended far beyond the immediate financial stability his discovery had provided. The most profound changes emerged through opportunities to reconnect his military experience with meaningful civilian contribution in ways that conventional employment pathways had never accommodated. 5 years after his underground discovery, these connections had created a life unimaginable during his desperate days in the tunnels beneath Manhattan. On a crisp autumn morning, Michael stood before an audience of veterans, military transition specialists, and government officials at the National Veterans Employment Summit, preparing to deliver a keynote address that would formalize approaches he had developed through personal experience and subsequent professional engagement. The contrast between this moment and his lowest point was not lost on him. From homeless tunnel resident to recognized authority on specialized veteran employment pathways within 5 years. The greatest challenge many veterans face isn't finding just any civilian job, Michael began, his voice steady and purposeful. It's finding meaningful work that utilizes the capabilities we developed through military service without requiring us to abandon the operational identity that defined our most significant contributions. This disconnect creates not just employment difficulties but profound psychological challenges that standard transition programs rarely address effectively. His presentation outlined the specialized consulting organization he had developed using his discovery resources, Unconventional Pathways initiative, which created employment connections for veterans with significant service experience, but limited conventional credentials. The approach focused specifically on veterans whose PTSD and related conditions complicated traditional employment while preserving specialized capabilities valuable in appropriate contexts. We've identified 17 distinct professional domains where veterans with significant combat experience but limited formal credentials can provide exceptional value that conventional employees simply cannot match, Michael explained, highlighting successful placements ranging from infrastructure security assessment to crisis management consulting. These positions specifically utilize capabilities developed under extreme operational conditions rather than treating military experience as merely a character reference for unrelated civilian functions. The presentation included case studies of veterans whose service-related challenges had created civilian employment barriers similar to those Michael had experienced, individuals whose hypervigilance, environmental sensitivity, or procedural rigidity complicated conventional workplaces but provided advantages in specialized contexts, requiring exactly those attributes when properly channeled and supported. A Marine who cannot function effectively in standard office environments due to hypervigilance and startle response may provide exceptional value in security vulnerability assessment, where those same attributes create observational advantages unavailable to conventional analysts, Michael noted, referencing documented outcomes rather than merely theoretical possibilities. The key isn't forcing adaptation to conventional environments, but identifying contexts where operational attributes create specific professional advantages. What distinguished Michael's approach from standard veteran employment programs was its focus on connecting military operational identity with civilian professional value rather than merely teaching adaptation skills or providing generic employment assistance. This approach acknowledged that military service created not just transferable skills, but fundamental operational perspectives that could provide significant civilian value when properly matched with appropriate contexts. The audience response reflected the approach's demonstrable results. Over 3 years, Unconventional Pathways had created specialized employment connections for more than 280 veterans with significant combat experience and service-related conditions that complicated conventional employment. These placements maintained 87% retention after 2 years, compared to 34% for similar veterans in standard employment placement programs. Following the formal presentation, Michael participated in a panel discussion with government officials responsible for veteran transition programming, where he advocated for fundamental reconsideration of how military experience translated to civilian employment contexts. We need to stop treating military service as merely a developmental period that provides generic workplace attributes, and start recognizing the specific operational capabilities that combat creates, which have no civilian equivalent but substantial specialized value. By emphasizing continuity between operational capabilities and specialized civilian applications, Michael provided pathway for maintaining personal integration rather than compartmentalizing military experience as irrelevant to civilian contribution. The session included practical guidance for identifying potential employment domains where combat experience provided legitimate advantages rather than complications, infrastructure security assessment, emergency management, specialized training, operations, crisis response planning, and other fields where the heightened situational awareness and procedural discipline developed through military operations created professional value rather than workplace friction. One participant, a former Army combat engineer with 3 deployments and significant PTSD-related challenges in conventional employment, expressed the frustration many veterans experience during transition. Everyone thanks us for our service, but then expects us to become completely different people to get hired. They want the discipline and commitment without the hypervigilance and procedural precision that come from the same operational experience. Michael's response acknowledged this fundamental disconnect while offering constructive alternatives. Standard workplaces aren't designed for people whose operational capabilities were developed under combat conditions. Our approach isn't trying to force adaptation to environments that fundamentally conflict with those capabilities, but identifying specialized contexts where those same attributes create exceptional value when properly applied and supported. This reframing transformed the transition challenge from personal deficiency, requiring correction, to contextual mismatch, requiring appropriate placement, preserving dignity and operational identity, while creating practical pathways for meaningful civilian contribution. The approach validated military experience as creating legitimate specialized capabilities, rather than merely providing character development requiring translation into completely different civilian applications. The evening concluded with site visit to one of Manhattan's underground infrastructure monitoring facilities, where Michael's Unconventional Pathways organization had developed specialized security assessment positions for veterans whose combat experience created hypervigilance that complicated conventional employment, but provided advantages in threat detection and environmental anomaly recognition. The facility employed 7 veterans with significant combat experience and PTSD-related conditions in roles specifically designed to utilize their heightened situational awareness while providing structural support that accommodated service-related challenges. The operational protocols incorporated regular rotation schedules that prevented fatigue-related symptom exacerbation, communication systems that reduced isolation-related anxiety, and environmental controls that minimized triggering conditions. Without compromising security effectiveness, these positions aren't accommodations or charity placements, explained Facility Security Director Robert Chun, who had implemented this specialized program after consulting with Michael's organization. They provide operational advantages we couldn't achieve with conventional security personnel, regardless of training or technology. The environmental sensitivity these veterans developed through combat experience creates detection capabilities that simply don't exist among civilians without that operational background. The program's effectiveness was demonstrated through quantifiable metric security breaches and environmental Anomalies were identified 47% faster by veterans with combat-related hypervigilance than by conventional security personnel with identical technical training but no combat experience. These results confirmed that appropriate employment contexts could transform service-related conditions from workplace liabilities into professional assets when properly structured and supported. As Michael observed the facility operations, he reflected on the distance he had traveled from his own desperate days in Manhattan's underground infrastructure, from homeless survival to developing specialized employment systems that created legitimate value from the same operational attributes that had complicated his conventional employment prospects after discharge. The following morning brought Michael to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for final planning session regarding the historical assessment project that had emerged from his original discovery. The meeting included security specialists, historical preservation experts, and Treasury officials responsible for coordinating multidisciplinary operations involving potential recovery of both historical artifacts and strategic materials with continuing government interest. As the planning team reviewed operational protocols for assessing the identified sites, Michael recognized familiar patterns from his military experience: the systematic preparation, contingency planning, and information security measures that characterized significant operations regardless of their specific objectives. The transition from military reconnaissance to historical assessment demonstrated the underlying continuity in operational methodology despite the dramatically different context and purpose. Our first assessment location presents unique challenges due to its proximity to active transit infrastructure, explained Federal Reserve Security Coordinator James Wilson, while reviewing site diagrams with specialized notations indicating potential access points and environmental hazards. Your experience navigating similar environments provides essential perspective for developing appropriate protocols that balance historical preservation requirements against operational security considerations. The planning session reflected the legitimacy that Michael's unusual background now provided in specialized contexts where conventional credentials proved inadequate for addressing unique operational challenges. His direct experience with both military reconnaissance and underground infrastructure navigation created capacity for identifying contingencies and operational considerations that traditional security personnel or historical researchers would likely overlook despite their professional expertise in more conventional applications. Most significantly, the operational planning incorporated Michael's insights regarding the psychological dimensions of extended underground operations, the environmental factors that could trigger anxiety or disorientation among team members. Without appropriate preparation and support, these considerations reflected his personal experience with both combat operations and subsequent PTSD-related challenges during his underground residence, creating practical knowledge unavailable through conventional training or academic preparation. We've incorporated your recommendations regarding team rotation schedules, communication protocols, and environmental conditioning procedures, Wilson noted while reviewing the operational timeline. These elements significantly enhance both team effectiveness and personnel sustainability compared to our standard operational parameters for secure facility assessment. The integration of Michael's experiences from military service through homelessness to historical discovery and subsequent professional development created operational wisdom that transcended any single aspect of his unusual journey. The synthesis transformed what could have remained merely personal narrative into systematic approach with practical applications across multiple domains requiring specialized environmental assessment under challenging conditions. Following the planning session, Michael visited the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where the exhibition featuring artifacts from his original discovery had been expanded to include comprehensive presentation on wartime financial security measures and their connection to industrial production priorities during national mobilization. The exhibition now served as educational resource for understanding how financial infrastructure supported military operations during periods of existential national threat. Dr. Margaret Chen, the museum's curator for financial history, greeted Michael with professional appreciation for his continuing contribution to historical understanding. Your discovery initiated research pathways that have transformed our understanding of how wartime financial security measures operated beyond the formal documentation available through conventional archives, she explained while guiding him through the expanded exhibition. The physical evidence you located provided verification for theoretical models that historians had developed but couldn't previously confirm through documentary evidence alone. The exhibition included interactive elements that helped visitors understand the complex relationship between strategic material allocation, financial security protocols, and industrial production priorities during wartime mobilization. These educational components transformed what might have remained specialized academic knowledge into accessible public understanding about how financial infrastructure supported national security during historical crisis periods. Most meaningful for Michael was the exhibition's thoughtful presentation of how his discovery had occurred, acknowledging his military background and subsequent challenges without sensationalizing his personal circumstances or reducing complex institutional failures to simplified narrative. The presentation respected both his privacy regarding specific details and the legitimate systemic issues his experience illustrated regarding veteran transition challenges following combat deployment. We've designed this presentation to highlight both the historical significance of your discovery and the broader context of veteran transition experiences that shaped your unique pathway to making this contribution. Dr. Chun explained. Visitors consistently identify this human element as creating meaningful connection with the technical historical content, helping them understand how individual circumstances intersect with broader historical processes. This integration of personal experience with institutional history reflected the genuine complexity of how historical discovery occurs, rarely through completely planned academic processes, but often through unexpected intersections between individual circumstances and broader historical developments that create unique opportunities for recovering knowledge that might otherwise remain permanently lost. As Michael concluded his visit to the museum, he encountered a school group receiving guided tour of the exhibition, with students asking thoughtful questions about both the historical artifacts and the circumstances of their discovery. The guide explained how Michael's military training had enabled him to recognize significance in architectural anomalies that others had overlooked for decades, creating connection between his service experience and his civilian historical contribution. This educational presentation of his experience provided perfect demonstration of the principle Michael had been developing through his unconventional pathways organization, that military operational capabilities retain substantial value in appropriate civilian contexts when properly recognized and positioned rather than suppressed or abandoned during transition. The students were learning not just about financial history, but about how specialized capabilities developed through military service could create unique civilian contributions when properly channeled. The day concluded with small recognition ceremony at the Federal Reserve, where Michael received formal appreciation for his continuing contribution to both historical understanding and security assessment methodology. The acknowledgement came from representatives of multiple institutions that had benefited from his unique combination of military training, personal experience with underground infrastructure, and subsequent professional development in specialized assessment operations. Your journey illustrates how exceptional value can emerge through unconventional pathways when institutions recognize and support the specialized capabilities that individuals develop through extraordinary circumstances. Observed Federal Reserve Historical Division Director Richard Keller during the ceremony. The contributions you've made to both historical understanding and security assessment Methodology demonstrate how military operational experience creates unique civilian value when properly recognized and positioned. This institutional validation represented significant evolution from the rejection Michael had experienced during his early transition attempts from systems that had failed to recognize his potential contribution to organizations that now specifically valued his unusual combination of capabilities and experiences. The transformation demonstrated how appropriate contextual matching could create exceptional outcomes where conventional employment processes had produced only frustration and rejection. That evening, Michael returned to his apartment in Queens, where photographs from his military service shared space with artifacts from his subsequent professional development, creating visual representation of the continuity he had established between his operational identity and civilian contribution. Unlike the compartmentalization many veterans experienced between their military and civilian lives, Michael had developed integration that preserved core aspects of his operational capabilities while applying them in contexts that created meaningful civilian value. The following morning brought notification that the Specialized Historical Assessment Project had received final approval with enhanced resources, based on preliminary findings that suggested significant potential for additional discoveries similar to Michael's original finding. The expanded project would involve multidisciplinary teams operating at all 7 identified locations, with Michael serving as senior consultant for both operational planning and on-site assessment activities. This development represented professional culmination of the pathway that had begun with his desperate underground survival and subsequent historical discovery. The capabilities that had once seemed irrelevant in civilian contexts now provided foundation for specialized contribution that conventional credentials couldn't match, regardless of academic or institutional background. The very experiences that had created barriers in standard employment processes now enabled exceptional performance in specialized contexts designed to utilize rather than suppress those operational attributes. 10 years after his initial discovery, Michael attended dedication ceremony for the Federal Reserve Historical Operations Center, a specialized facility designed for researching, preserving, and interpreting artifacts recovered through the expanded assessment program his original finding had initiated. The center included comprehensive educational components alongside secure research facilities, creating public understanding of how financial infrastructure had supported national security throughout American history. The ceremony included recognition of Michael's foundational contribution alongside acknowledgement of the many professionals who had subsequently expanded the historical recovery program into systematic institutional operation. This balanced presentation respected both his essential initiating role and the collective expertise required for transforming individual discovery into comprehensive historical understanding with continuing relevance for contemporary security operations. As Michael observed the center's operations, from specialized preservation laboratories to interactive educational exhibitions, he recognized the extraordinary distance he had traveled from the desperate circumstances that had initially driven him into Manhattan's underground infrastructure. The journey from homeless veteran to historical discoverer to recognized authority on specialized assessment operations illustrated how apparent catastrophe could create unexpected pathways to contribution when properly supported through transitional challenges. Sometimes our greatest contributions emerge through pathways we would never voluntarily choose, Michael reflected during the ceremony's concluding remarks. The capabilities we develop through challenging circumstances retain their value even when conventional systems fail to recognize their potential applications. Our responsibility lies in creating connections that transform apparent disconnection into meaningful contribution, both for ourselves and for others navigating similar transitions. This perspective offered framework not just for individual veterans but for institutions seeking to support effective transition between military service and civilian contribution. By recognizing the legitimate value of operational capabilities developed through extraordinary circumstances, these systems could create pathways that preserved essential identity while enabling meaningful application in appropriate civilian contexts. The unlikely sequence connecting wartime silver movement, abandoned infrastructure, veteran homelessness, and historical recovery had created opportunities that transcended any single aspect of Michael's journey. The integration of these diverse experiences had produced not just personal redemption, but institutional innovation that would continue creating value long after the original circumstances had faded from immediate relevance or public attention. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.